Welcome to the Healthcare Provider Happy Hour. This is a safe space where we invite healthcare providers to unapologetically be themselves after the working day. My name is Jennifer George, and each week I will connect you with guests and stories that will help transform your stress to success and fulfillment. Are you with me? Grab your drink of choice and let's chat. Hey everyone, welcome to the Healthcare Provider Happy Hour. I'm your host, Jennifer George, and I'm joining you today to chat with you about burnout, and more specifically, why female physicians are burning out more so than men. You know, this is something that I've been thinking about in general lately, about whether women burn out more so than men and why that is. And, you know, when I think about this, I feel a bit called to it. I feel empowered by it. I feel motivated by it. I feel inspired by it. I feel a sense of empowerment and connection and community. And I think that women in healthcare really need to bind together and to connect. You know, my experiences in healthcare have often been, especially earlier on in my career, in dealing with toxicity, you know, the result of that was often among women. And, you know, and I think that that is not uncommon, but it was my personal experience. So I think that's why I feel more drawn to this topic, because, you know, it kind of makes me have compassion for that back then, for what I had went through and what I had probably also been a part of, right, and contributed to in some way, by the fact that, you know, we tend to be more at risk. And so I came across an article by the Greater Good at the University of Berkeley in California, and they basically looked at physicians specifically in that profession. And I thought it was quite interesting, the things that they talked about and what they identified, and some ways to close the gap and help women, you know, heal through this a little bit. And what was even more interesting to me is that they followed a female physician through the article. And, you know, I'll explain to you at the end what she ultimately decided to do. But she was a spouse, so she was a wife, and she was also a mother and had children, and she was practicing. So basically, we should probably start with the definition of burnout to recap. And if you've been listening to this podcast, it's been a while since I've talked about this specifically. But basically, burnout is identified by different factors, 4 different factors: emotional exhaustion, cynicism, a lack of professional efficacy, or feeling like your work doesn't have a meaning anymore, you're not making an impact anymore, and kind of being more self-critical, and disconnection or depersonalization. And depersonalization, you know, can vary. It can be disconnection from yourself, from your thoughts, but also ultimately from your colleagues and your patients. And what they found was that generally 50% of physicians and 50% of med students also are reporting burnout, okay, and feeling burnt out. Specifically, women were 60% more likely to report feeling burnt out. So whether they just were more likely to report it, or whether, you know, the stat itself is true of women experiencing burnout, but they were more likely to report it. So females specifically reported emotional exhaustion as being the greatest factor on affecting their burnout, whereas men experienced more depersonalization and reported that. They also found that it affected the younger demographics more so than the older demographics of physicians, which led these researchers to think that perhaps the profession of medicine, that many men are more at senior level, because the age category is younger for higher rates of burnout reported. Another thing they identified in the gender of burnout was that there was a great pay gap between men and women. Okay, that female physicians are making $90,000 less on average compared to their male counterparts. So they asked the question, well, why are women more prone to burnout or reporting higher rates of burnout? And I found this a bit interesting, actually. So women, when they're choosing their, you know, profession of medicine, because there's many different areas of medicine you can get into, they tend to choose the profession of medicine that's more flexible, which you would think is great, right? But it ultimately means that they have to do more in less time. And what they further found was that their sessions were actually 10% longer overall than their male counterparts. And even further interesting to me, which I thought was, super interesting, but I'm not at all surprised either, is that there's a greater patient expectation with respect to empathy and communication when working with and interacting with female physicians. Okay, so that's the patient perspective, and I thought that was really interesting, and that explains a lot. And finally, 70% of women reported discrimination on the job, not only from staff, but also from patients. And there's this greater connection with women between their work life and their home life that they tend to blur, and that a third of women actually experienced discrimination for simply being a mother. Okay, so related to being a mother. What was even more concerning to me, and I was actually surprised by this, was that women physicians were more than twice likely to die by suicide compared to men. So that's not okay. Okay, we need to do better for each other. So how can we close this gap? Okay, we need to start changing the culture. Okay, there's a lot of gaps going on, right? There's a lot of disparity, gender-wise, pay-wise, and they even go on to talk about opportunity-wise as well. Offering parental leave, hopefully paid parental leave, and daycare, things like that. And apparently in Europe, there are healthcare organizations doing this. And there are other professions in North America and in the US that are doing this, but not so much in healthcare in the US. Career development opportunities that address women's needs, right? So maybe if there was more leadership, let's say, or opportunities where women can, grow, maybe that would kind of set, again, a cultural tone and a change that, women will aspire to grow and develop, and again, to support one another as best they can. Wellness programs, this is something that I've talked about as well in this podcast, but not only having the program, but also having the time allotted for staff to engage in these programs of self-care. So like exercising, yoga, mindfulness, taking a nap, meditation, whatever it might be. And another thing they talked about was mentorship. So, and it makes sense if, let's say male physicians are more senior level and they're experiencing less burnout, to kind of maybe have cross conversations between junior level staff and senior level staff. And finally, burnout interventions can be better addressed if specific demographics or at-risk demographics were acknowledged. So it's one thing to check in with everybody, but it's another thing to dig a little deeper and find out, who is more at risk and how can we help them. So what about you? Have you ever noticed or wondered about burnout when it came to gender? Have you ever seen or noticed a trend in people that experiencing burnout being more male than female? Again, this article is linked specifically to physicians, but I'm pretty confident that you can extrapolate this to, the greater healthcare profession as a whole. The one thing I will say, and I told you I would tell you how the article ends, I don't mean to spoil it, but I think it's important for you to know that this female physician who they were following, she ultimately left her husband in order to protect herself from burnout. And I thought, wow, like that's powerful. It came to that. Okay. And ultimately her children were most important to her, right? And she loved her work. And, in a way I'm thinking, well, you're spending less time with your children, but it's not about that too. It's about the quality of time. So, she's probably spending more time, I would think, being with her children rather than just doing for them in, the spaces that she would have outside of work and her personal life. So I applaud her, and I hope she's doing well, and I hope she's staying well. And I really appreciated this article. So I will attach the link in the show notes. I encourage you to check it out. And if you find it interesting or if you have any thoughts on this, I would love to hear them. My handle at Instagram is bestobsessedwithjen. And you could just simply DM me and we can talk more about this. If you liked this podcast specifically, or if you liked other podcasts, please take the time to review them. It means the world to me, and it really does help me move this podcast forward. So until we chat next time, take care of each other and stay happy. So if you guys like this podcast, please subscribe and leave an honest review. Your feedback means everything to me. Your reviews are what moves this podcast forward, and I always appreciate receiving them. If you want to get a hold of me directly, reach out to me on social media. My handles are in the show notes, and you can always subscribe to my weekly newsletters at jennifergeorge.co so that we can stay connected. So until next time, thank you guys so much again for your ongoing support.